This episode is brought to you by Michelob Ultra. Michelob Ultra is perfect for more than just the summer heat this year, because not only is it refreshing and crisp with only 95 calories, but Ultra is also the official beer sponsor of Team USA at the Olympic Games Paris 2024. Celebrate every point, race, and moment with Team USA and Michelob Ultra for the Olympic Games Paris 2024. Stock up on Michelob Ultra and cheer on Team USA. Enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2024 Anheuser-Busch Michelob Ultra Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
Welcome to the Philosophemes podcast, where we do philosophy the traditional way. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino. So grateful you're here. The Philosophemes podcast is proudly part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. If you're looking for excellent podcasts, you'll find them on Evergreen. Thank you for supporting and sharing this educational podcast. Any political or religious ideas discussed in this episode are solely for the sake of philosophical education. Everyone is welcome here on the Philosophemes podcast. All right, so when you're reading Nietzsche, it's helpful to understand the history of Nietzsche's writings. When we refer to Nietzsche's official writings, of course, we are referring to Nietzsche's canon. Whatever writings are considered part of Nietzsche's canon, those are the writings we consider when working out Nietzsche's philosophy, working out Nietzsche's thoughts. And when Nietzsche scholars look at Nietzsche's writings, there are standard, we could say canonical, ways to divide up Nietzsche's writings. Knowing these divisions is quite helpful when it comes to working out Nietzsche's thought, or trying to figure out what Nietzsche was saying. Here is a strange question that we can ask that may help us see the value of knowing Nietzsche's canon. If Nietzsche started writing philosophy in 1872, and it took Nietzsche until 1883 to formulate his ideas of the eternal return and amor fati, then how should we think about the relationship between his ideas in 1883 and his ideas in 1872? For example, did he change his mind? Did he think his earlier thoughts were wrong? Knowing Nietzsche's canon, therefore, helps us see the big picture. So, how are we supposed to think about the evolution of Nietzsche's thought across his writings? According to Nietzsche scholars, there are three distinct phases to Nietzsche's canon. They are referred to as early, middle, and late. We'll talk about when these phases occur, what ideas are associated with each phase, and how the different phases relate to the whole of Nietzsche's canon. The first phase lasts 10 years, the second phase lasts 4 years, and the final phase lasts only 1 year. The early phase, the birth of tragedy to the joyful quest, or Die Frohliche Wissenschaft. Nietzsche lived from 1844 to 1900. Academically, he published a number of articles in the discipline of the classics before publishing in philosophy. His philosophical writings are standardly considered to begin with the birth of tragedy. And there are several interesting stories regarding the birth of tragedy that are relevant for us. Though the birth of tragedy was first published in 1872, Nietzsche's identity as a philosopher is thought to have begun in 1870, when he delivered 2 lectures at the Great Hall of the Museum of the University of Basel. These lectures would later be recognized as the origin of the birth of tragedy. In January of 1870, he delivered a lecture titled The Greek Music Drama, and in February, he delivered a lecture titled Socrates and Tragedy. Nietzsche gave copies of these lectures to Richard Wagner and Wagner's wife, Cosima. and both of them, in separate letters, encouraged Nietzsche to write a book about tragedy. By July of that year, Nietzsche had decided to write such a book, and began to construct an essay titled The Dionysian World View, or, as some people pronounce it, the Dionysian Worldview. The German word, here translated as worldview, is of course Weltanschauung. This is important to note because Anschauung is a technical term in the Kantian philosophy. It is the term that Kant uses for the word intuition. And Nietzsche would have been aware of this. He would have been aware of the fact that Anschauung is a technical term in the Kantian philosophy. A paraphrased version of Nietzsche's essay, The Dionysian Worldview, would later become the beginning portion of The Birth of Tragedy. Thus, Dionysus inaugurates Nietzsche's philosophy, and Dionysus remains present throughout the entirety of Nietzsche's writings. The early or first phase of Nietzsche's philosophy runs from the publication of the first edition of The Birth of Tragedy in 1872 to 1882, with the publication of the first edition of Die Frohliche Wissenschaft, which has been variously translated as The Joyful Wisdom, The Cheerful Science, The Gay Science, or, as I have suggested repeatedly, The Joyful Quest.
Ever heard of Stoicism? Chances are, if you have, you've heard of Stoicism with a lowercase s and not Stoicism with an uppercase S. Lone wolves, no emotions, antisocial behavior, cold indifference. All that is Stoicism with a lowercase s. Stoicism with an uppercase S is the ancient Greek philosophy and virtue ethics framework that centers on service to the cosmopolis, to include your family, friends, community, and planet, and the development of a good moral character. My name is Tanner Campbell, and I'm the host of Practical Stoicism, a 3 times a week podcast teaching Stoic principles and concepts to anyone interested through the exploration of texts and deep dives into various moral topics. You can find Practical Stoicism where you're already listening to podcasts by searching for Practical Stoicism or by going to stoicismpod.com. I invite you to give it a listen today. You just might like it.
This first decade of Nietzsche's philosophical writings includes his untimely meditations, sometimes translated as thoughts out of season. Though Nietzsche's plan was to write 13 essays, in the end, these meditations, spanning from 1873 to 1876, total only 4. The first one is David Strauss, the Confessor and Writer. The second is On the Use and Abuse of History for Life. The third is Schopenhauer as Educator. And the fourth is Richard Wagner in Beirut. The rest of the decade of the early phase in the history of Nietzsche's philosophical writings is filled by what is known as the Free Spirit Trilogy of Human All Too Human, 1878, The Dawn, 1881, sometimes translated as Daybreak, and the first edition of The Joyful Quest, 1882. It was in the first edition of The Joyful Quest that Nietzsche first expressed his eureka idea of the eternal return. Thus, this book and this revelation opened a new phase in Nietzsche's philosophical history. The middle phase, then, runs from Thus Spoke Zarathustra to On the Genealogy of Morals, 1883 to 1887. This second or middle phase begins with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and this middle phase concludes with On the Genealogy of Morals, then, in 1887. Also, this phase is characterized by the publication of the second edition of The Joyful Quest in 1887. Interestingly, it is in this phase that Nietzsche began self-publishing his books, starting with Beyond Good and Evil in 1886. Thus, over half of Nietzsche's books were self-published. And it is during this phase, this middle phase, that Nietzsche develops his philosophical ideas of 1. The eternal return, 2. The Übermensch or Superman, 3. Perspectivism, and 4. Amor fati. Of course, these ideas are not just intimately related to one another, they are intimately related to the ideas developed in the first phase, especially the Dionysian worldview. In fact, these ideas may be seen as expressions of parts of the Dionysian worldview, and ideas with which to bring the Dionysian worldview into focus. A deep consistency can be discerned, for example, across Nietzsche's early and middle phases by recognizing that all of these ideas are made coherent through Nietzsche's theory of tragedy, the theory he initially worked out in his essay, The Dionysian Worldview. There are two widely held misunderstandings regarding Nietzsche's middle phase, stemming from stereotypical approaches to reading Nietzsche, and they obscure the centrality of Nietzsche's Dionysian worldview. First, Nietzsche himself referred to his Zarathustra as his greatest achievement, and over the years Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, found in his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, became extremely popular. However, it's worth recalling that Beyond Good and Evil was supposed to be the prose version of the insights provided more dramatically in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and Beyond Good and Evil does not discuss the Übermensch. We'll talk about the Superman in a separate episode. Suffice to say here, the Superman should be understood in the context of Nietzsche's perspectivism. In other words, the Superman coincides with the lion in the three metamorphoses of spirit. We have an episode coming up on the three metamorphoses of spirit very soon. All right, in regard then to the late phase begins with Twilight of the Idols and ends with The Will to Power. All of the writings in the late phase take place in 1888. Nietzsche's late phase provides an even more explicit return to his work on pre-Platonic philosophers, tragedy, and the Dionysian worldview than is seen in his middle phase. This is also the phase where Christianity is most explicitly criticized. What is more, the paroxysmal characterization of Nietzsche's late phase is usually supported by highlighting the explosiveness with which Nietzsche published in the year 1888, before his collapse in January of 1889. These writings include The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist or Anti-Christian, and his autobiographical Ecce Homo, Nietzsche contra Wagner, and then the unpublished writings, also known as The Will to Power. And I include them all here in 1888, but of course, these are notes that are left over from the very beginning of Nietzsche's writings. Lastly, taking into consideration the phases of Nietzsche's writings helps us see that the goal of the positive side of Nietzsche's philosophy, an articulation of the Dionysian worldview, renders his philosophy overall sufficiently consistent and coherent. Just as his 1870 essay, The Dionysian Worldview, may be seen discussing the relationship between tragedy and life, so too, in his early phase, Nietzsche already had what, in my book, Full Throttle Heart, The Rapture and Ecstasy of Nietzsche's Dionysian Worldview, I refer to as the first two of his three highest ideas, and the unifying principle of his philosophy. Recognizing the repetition of Nietzsche's highest ideas across the phases of his philosophical writings and the reiteration of the Greco-German philosophical context provides direct support for the claim that Nietzsche's philosophy is consistent. On the positive side, he consistently restates the sense in which the Dionysian worldview provides the highest revelation of the meaning and value of existence, a revelation preserved by ancient Greek culture in their understanding of the relationship between tragedy and life. Whereas Nietzsche's early phase emphasized the philosophy of the past, Later, he emphasized the philosophy of the future, criticizing the decadent elements of our present culture, which must give way for us to affirm the return of the Dionysian worldview. Thus spoke Nietzsche. Hence, this relation between tragedy and life that indicates the Dionysian worldview appears in the 1870 essay. Then, in 1872, with The Birth of Tragedy. Later then also, in all of the books of the middle phase, except on the genealogy of morals, which is almost exclusively a critical illustration of his second highest idea. The uniqueness of the middle phase is that the discovery of this third highest idea is what initiates it. The eternal recurrence of existence as the third highest idea fills in the missing metaphysics of the Dionysian worldview, providing Nietzsche with a deeper expression for his existential thesis regarding the relationship between tragedy and life. With the middle phase providing the means to deepen the insights of the early phase, it remained for the late phase to emphasize the critical side. In other words, using Zarathustra's joyful quest beyond good and evil to criticize life-denying philosophies. This is the project of his transvaluation of all values, a recontextualization in terms of life-denying and life-affirming. In addition to the soteriological project of Nietzsche's philosophy in the late phase also engages in the ontological project of reiterating the Dionysian worldview, reminding us that he is repeating thoughts found in The Birth of Tragedy by way of the middle phases working out its metaphysical characterization through the eternal return. You especially see this in Twilight of the Idols, Ecce Homo, and The Will to Power. Hence, Nietzsche's canon divides Nietzsche's writings into three phases. We can characterize those phases by the ideas that mark their completion. Thus, the Dionysian worldview is first. Second is the eternal return and amor fati. And lastly is the transvaluation of all values and the Dionysian worldview in terms of the eternal return and amor fati. So when you're reading a passage from Nietzsche, by way of Nietzsche's canon, you can identify the phase in which he wrote the passage. You can then consider what he was attempting to accomplish by writing that passage. You can have a clearer and deeper idea of how that passage fits into his overall philosophy, for example, and especially in regard to his Dionysian worldview and the transvaluation of all values. All right. We are posting videos on YouTube and X, selling books on Amazon, and you can see the Philosophemes in puzzle form on Instagram. I appreciate your questions and comments and your support of this open access educational podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino, and I'll see you in the next episode.